There's a photograph sitting in NASA's own archive that nobody in the agency has ever fully explained. Not erased, not classified, just left there quietly for 59 years, hoping the internet would never look closely enough to ask the question everyone is suddenly asking again in 2026. What if the strangest part of the moon story was never about aliens at all, but about how easily a shadow, a mistake, and a silence can turn into something that outlives everyone who created it? Read that again. A shadow, a mistake, a silence. That is the entire machine behind one of the most persistent legends in modern space history. And once you understand how it was built, you will never watch a NASA hid this video the same way again. Here is where it starts. November 20th, 1966. Lunar Orbiter 2, a robotic NASA satellite the size of a small car, is drifting above the Sea of Tranquility, methodically photographing potential landing zones for the Apollo missions that have not happened yet. Nobody on the ground is looking for anything unusual. This is a survey mission. Grainy, black and white film, mechanical cameras, radioed back to Earth one scan line at a time. And then, in a routine batch of images, something appears that nobody in the room knows how to file. 6 shapes. Long, narrow, impossibly sharp shadows stretching across a lunar plane, some as short as 20 feet, one reaching 75 feet. Thin, dark lines pointed like needles across the gray dust, unlike the soft, round shadows every boulder and ridge on the moon usually casts. Within days, the image reaches Thomas O'Toole, a science reporter at the Washington Post. November 23rd, 1966, he writes a story that will quietly detonate for the next 60 years. The 6 shadows, he reports, were hailed by scientists as one of the most unusual features of the moon ever photographed. One scientist calls the effect the moon's Christmas tree pattern. Another calls it the fairy fort effect. A third, only half joking, suggests naming the region the Valley of Monuments. Think about what that means. This isn't a fringe blogger squinting at a JPEG at 2 a.m. This is the Washington Post in 1966, quoting actual scientists using the word monuments about something photographed on the moon 3 years before Apollo 11 ever landed there. The story didn't start on the internet. It started in a national newspaper on the record with credentialed voices struggling to explain what they were looking at. But here's where it gets worse. A researcher named William Blair, working at the time for Boeing's Institute of Biotechnology, a company subcontracted to build parts of the Lunar Orbiter program itself, takes out a compass and a protractor and starts measuring the angles between the 6 shapes. He notices the objects are arranged in a pattern of right-angled and isosceles triangles, and he does something that no cautious scientist is supposed to do in public. He compares the long, needle-thin shadows to the shadows cast by Egyptian obelisks. Not natural rock formations, obelisks, man-made towers. He is careful, almost too careful, to say he is not claiming these are the work of an intelligence, but then he writes the sentence that will be quoted for the next 6 decades. That if a complex of structures like this were photographed on Earth, any archaeologist's first move would be to send a team to dig test trenches and find out what's buried there. Sit with that for a second. A scientist working inside the American space program in an internal capacity is the one who first floats the comparison to intentional construction. This isn't an outsider's theory grafted onto NASA after the fact. It grows from the inside, from someone with legitimate access to the data, using legitimate scientific method, measurement, geometry, comparative shadow analysis, and arriving at a conclusion strange enough that it needed to be walked back almost as soon as it was said. And this is where everything changes, because the story doesn't die there. It becomes the seed of something much bigger, the founding myth for an entire genre of the moon is hiding something. Content that is, right now in 2026, more viral than it has been in decades. What most people are not seeing is how fast the official explanation actually arrived, and how unsatisfying it turned out to be for anyone who wanted the mystery to stay alive. Other scientists at Boeing, the very company that built the spacecraft taking the photographs, looked at Blair's obelisk comparison and rejected it almost immediately. Richard Shorthill of the Boeing Scientific Research Laboratory, an expert in lunar topography, dismissed the idea outright, arguing the shapes were nothing more than ordinary boulders photographed under an extremely low sun angle, a lighting condition capable of stretching a 2-foot rock into a shadow 50 or 70 feet long. Years later, the planetary scientist Donald Wilhelms, writing a serious academic history of the Lunar Orbiter program, was blunter still. He described the whole episode as the mistake of an unnamed USGS geologist who should have known better, misreading ordinary boulder shadows as spires, a blunder, he wrote, that the sensationalist press, and in his words, various nuts, seized on as evidence of missile bases planted on the moon. Notice the word he used. Missiles, not tourist attractions, not archaeological ruins, military installations. because that is what a Cold War mind reached for first in 1966, staring at something it could not immediately explain. Not ancient aliens, but the other superpower. This detail matters more than it seems. It tells you that from the very first moment, this story was never really about the moon. It was about fear. Fear of what an adversary might be doing somewhere humans couldn't yet verify. 60 years later, the fear has changed shape. Aliens instead of Soviets. But the underlying psychological engine driving the theory has never changed at all. But the official explanation, tidy as it sounds, never actually closed the case for everyone. Because here's the detail almost no retelling of this story includes: the shadows were genuinely, measurably strange, even to the people trying to debunk them. A photographic researcher named Lan Fleming spent years going back through the original Lunar Orbiter 2 catalog data, the precise angle of sunlight, 10.9 degrees above the horizon, exactly the kind of raking low light that stretches shadows dramatically. And when he modeled the shapes the objects themselves would need to have to cast those exact shadows at that exact sun angle, several of them came out taller than they were wide, a proportion almost impossible for a naturally deposited boulder, which tends to be squat, rounded, and wider than it is tall, the way loose rock settles under its own gravity over billions of years. One of the shapes, by his calculation, would have to be a slender cylinder roughly 15 meters high. Not a boulder, not a ridge, a cylinder. Read that again. The debunking itself, done honestly, with real orbital mechanics and real photographic data, still produced a shape that shouldn't naturally exist in that form on an airless, geologically dead plane. That gap, the space between this is obviously just rocks and this shape doesn't behave like rocks usually do, is the exact crack in the foundation that every version of this legend has been quietly living inside ever since. Not proof of anything artificial. But not a clean, boring answer either. And an audience faced with an ambiguous gap like that will almost always fill it with the most dramatic explanation available. This is not chaos. This is how myths are engineered. Not by liars, but by real uncertainty left unresolved for decades. Now watch what happens to that crack once it leaves the hands of scientists and enters the hands of storytellers. Through the 1970s and 80s, the Blair Cuspids, as they came to be known, folding Blair's name permanently into the mystery, get picked up by a growing ecosystem of paranormal researchers, fringe archaeologists, and Cold War-adjacent conspiracy writers who are simultaneously chasing a separate, even more famous anomaly, a shadowy formation on Mars that, under a certain lighting angle in a 1976 Viking orbiter photo, appeared to resemble a human face. The same names, the same self-published newsletters, the same slow migration from interesting anomaly to the space agencies are hiding something, begin to treat the Moon and Mars cases as two fronts of the same hidden war. Evidence, they argue, that has to be suppressed because acknowledging it would rewrite everything humanity believes about its place in the universe. And this is where the authority effect kicks in, and it is worth understanding exactly how it works, because it is the single most powerful tool this entire genre has ever had. The most influential promoters of artificial structures on the Moon, theories, were rarely outsiders. They were people who had once stood inside the room, former NASA-adjacent consultants, aerospace contractors, science broadcasters who had covered Apollo missions live from major networks. When someone with those credentials says, "What I saw inside the space program was different from what the public was told," it lands with a force that no anonymous blogger could ever generate. It doesn't matter that their specific claims, glass domes, geometric ruins enhanced out of grainy analog film, satellite photos supposedly rephotographed to hide detail, were never independently verified by any peer-reviewed institution. The credibility of the messenger transfers onto the claim, whether the claim has earned it or not. That transfer of trust is the real mechanism, not evidence. Trust, borrowed and spent. Think about what that means for a moment, because it is not unique to the Moon. It is the exact same mechanism that powers almost every modern institutional distrust movement. The insider testimony, unfalsifiable but emotionally undeniable, arriving at precisely the moment the public's patience with official explanations is thinnest. And in the story of the Moon, the patience has never been thinner than it is right now. Because here is what most people scrolling past a NASA knew for decades title in 2026 do not realize. This legend isn't reheated nostalgia. It is surging again, in real time, for reasons that have almost nothing to do with 1966 and everything to do with the last 12 months. In early 2026, NASA actually did something it had not done in more than 50 years. It sent a crew of 4 astronauts, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen, around the far side of the Moon aboard the Orion capsule, as part of the Artemis II mission, the first crewed lunar flyby since Apollo 17 left the Moon in 1972. For roughly 40 minutes, as Orion passed behind the far side, the spacecraft lost all communication with Earth entirely. A total blackout, no telemetry, no voice, nothing but silence and orbital mechanics deciding whether 4 human beings would come back around the curve of the moon on schedule. And then, when they did, Christina Koch's first words to Mission Control were broadcast to the entire world. Houston, integrity, comcheck. It is so great to hear from Earth again. That blackout, that 40 minutes where nobody on the planet could see or hear what was happening around the far side of the moon, is exactly the kind of silence this legend has always fed on. Because the moment the feed came back, and the crew safely splashed down in the Pacific on April 10th, 2026, something almost nobody at NASA expected happened instead of relief. A flood of misinformation broke out across X, TikTok, and Facebook. False claims that the flyby had been staged in a studio, that the crew's footage was AI generated, and that a small floating toy ball used to demonstrate weightlessness had glitched on camera the way a green screen composite would. A single fabricated image, supposedly showing the crew floating in front of a green screen, was viewed more than 1 million times on X alone. Hashtags like fake space and fake NASA trended for days. Digital forensics experts eventually traced the glitch to a broadcaster's failed text overlay during a syndicated rebroadcast of the feed. Not evidence of fabrication at all, but by the time the correction circulated, the damage to public trust had already been done 1,000 times over. This is not the 1960s anymore. The tools for manufacturing doubt travel at the speed of a phone screen now, and they move faster than any correction ever will. And this is where it gets worse, because the timing of the next announcement made everything catch fire at once. Around the same window, NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman confirmed that Artemis III, the mission originally meant to actually put boots back on the lunar surface, was being pushed back, its landing objective quietly, stripped out and replaced with a simple lunar orbit, moving any real surface landing to Artemis 4 or V no earlier than 2028. NASA framed the delay as the result of ongoing fueling and technical complications with the Artemis II hardware itself, a mechanical, unglamorous, entirely plausible explanation. But plausible explanations have never been enough to satisfy an audience already primed by 60 years of unresolved shadows. Because almost immediately, conspiracy theorists and self-styled NASA detractors began claiming the agency wasn't delaying the landing because of fuel systems at all. They were delaying it to buy time, to hide something recently detected on the far side of the moon, something described in increasingly dramatic terms as an ancient structure, a lost city, evidence too large and too undeniable to explain away with a press release. Notice what just happened there. A 60-year-old ambiguous shadow from 1966 and a 2026 fuel system delay, completely unconnected events, separated by half a century, have now been fused into a single unbroken narrative in the minds of millions of viewers, because the emotional shape of both stories is identical. Something was seen. Something was not explained fast enough. Therefore, something is being hidden. The specific facts barely matter anymore. The pattern is what people are responding to. This is the part that should genuinely unsettle you, more than any claim about towers or domes ever could. It isn't that NASA is hiding a structure on the moon. There is no credible evidence of that, and no serious lunar scientists studying decades of high-resolution orbital imagery, including the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which has photographed the Blair Cuspid site itself multiple times since 2009, at resolution the original 1966 cameras could never have dreamed of, and show nothing but ordinary boulders and crater debris, has ever found anything to support it. What should unsettle you is how easily and how fast an old, unresolved anomaly and a brand new, unrelated delay can be stitched together into a story that spreads to millions of people before a single fact-checker even finishes reading the headline. That fusion, old myth plus new silence, updated in real time, is the actual machine. And it is running faster in 2026 than it has ever run before. Here is the deeper layer most retellings never reach, because it requires looking past the moon entirely and toward what is actually happening around it right now. This resurgence isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening while a second, very real lunar race is quietly intensifying between the world's major space powers. China's Chang'e program has already returned samples from the lunar far side, a feat no nation had ever achieved before, and has announced ambitions for a permanent robotic and eventually crewed research station near the lunar South Pole by the early 2030s, in direct competition with NASA's own Artemis architecture aimed at the exact same region. The reason both programs are converging on the South Pole isn't mystery or myth, it's water. Permanently shadowed craters near the pole are believed to hold billions of kilograms of frozen water ice, a resource that could be split into breathable oxygen and rocket fuel, effectively turning the moon into a refueling station for missions to Mars and beyond. Whoever secures the best real estate near those craters first gains a strategic and economic advantage that could shape spaceflight for the rest of the century. Think about what that means for the wider story. A genuine, high-stakes multi-nation competition over lunar territory and resources is unfolding right now, mostly out of public view, discussed mainly in budget hearings and aerospace trade publications, rather than primetime news. Into that vacuum of public attention steps a far more emotionally satisfying story, hidden alien structures, because it is simpler, more cinematic, and requires no understanding of orbital fuel economics or permanently shadowed crater geology to feel important. The real competition for the moon is quiet, bureaucratic, and genuinely consequential. The mythical competition is loud, visual, and viral. Guess which one wins the algorithm every single time? And this is where the consequences stop being about the moon at all and start being about something closer to home. Every time a NASA hid this for decades narrative outperforms accurate reporting on what NASA is actually doing. Delays, budget fights, genuine scientific discoveries about lunar ice and geology, real international competition for strategic lunar territory, public understanding of an enormously important moment in space history gets a little bit more distorted. People who could be following one of the most significant developments of the decade, a new space race with real economic and military stakes, are instead absorbing a 59-year-old shadow story dressed up in new footage. The myth doesn't just survive. It actively crowds out the real story every time it resurfaces. And 2026 has proven it can do that faster than ever, thanks to tools that didn't exist even 5 years ago. Generative video, instant meme templates, algorithmic feeds that reward the most emotionally charged claim rather than the most accurate one. What most people are not seeing is that this pattern is not going to fade after Artemis III eventually flies. If anything, the next several years are precision built to make it worse. NASA has publicly committed to putting boots back on the lunar surface, likely for the first time since 1972, sometime around 2028, and that landing will happen near the South Pole in one of the most unexplored, permanently shadowed, geologically strange regions of the entire moon, an area no human eye has ever examined up close. Every camera on that mission, every rock sample, every unexpected shadow crossing a crater wall in low polar sunlight is going to be scrutinized instantly by an audience already primed for 60 years to expect something is being hidden from them. And if that landing gets delayed again for fuel, for budget, for weather, for any of the 100 boring reasons real space missions actually get delayed, the same fusion that just happened in 2026 will happen again, probably faster, probably louder, probably reaching more people before a single scientist gets a chance to explain what actually happened. So here's the question worth sitting with long after this video ends. Not whether there is a structure on the moon. There almost certainly isn't, and 6 decades of increasingly powerful cameras have had every opportunity to find one and never have. The real question is what happens to a species that keeps choosing the more thrilling story over the more accurate one, again and again, for 60 straight years, every single time real ambiguity leaves the smallest crack in an official explanation. What happens when the next genuine lunar surprise, and there will be one because the South Pole is still almost entirely unexplored, gets discovered, and nobody can tell anymore whether it's real evidence or just the next chapter in a myth that has been rewriting itself since 1966. The shadows on that 1966 photograph are still sitting exactly where Lunar Orbiter 2 found them, unmoved, unclassified, fully public, waiting for absolutely anyone to go look at the actual data for themselves. And after everything you now know about how this story was built, one shadow at a time, silence layered on silence, myth fused onto delay, the only real mystery left is why so few people ever do.